Hey, what's up guys? Before we start, I want to say that this vid will not have any important visual support, which means that you can consume this content as if it was a podcast while doing something else, like being on the bus or, I don't know, washing your dishes. Today we're going to go back and take a look at all the patches that happened between the launch of Elden Ring and the latest patch, which is patch 1.10. This has been requested because a lot of people are coming back for the DLC and they have been missing a large chunk of the Elden Ring lifespan and they want to get up to date. Maybe that's you. Maybe you want to get up to date with all the changes that have happened between then until now. All right, so let's go. So we're gonna take a look at it briefly because what's most important is the current state of the game, but I think it's also good to remind ourselves as to what kind of changes the game went through. So as you can see, the first patch 1.1.02, like the changes are very broad. We're not going to really take a look at that, stuff like improved play control, text adjustment, balance adjustment. They don't really go into specifics. So, we're going to skip this one. Let's go to 1.03. We got some things that were noteworthy. We got a lot of bug fixes, interactions such as like Fire Deadly Sin, like have been patched in 1.03. There was also stuff like Royal Knight Resolve and Determination in the off end. Lots of bug fixes in 1.03. A big nerf that happened early in the game in 1.03 was the nerf of Hoarfrost Stomp, which to this day has never really been to the extent that it was at launch. Hoarfrost Stomp used to be a juggernaut. You could basically spam that shit, and it was like one of the strongest Ash of War in the game, but this was nerfed early on in patch 1.03. There's a lot of changes that happened to this patch, but there's not that much that I believe is noteworthy, like stuff like, increase damage of the following sorcery, gravity well, blah, blah, blah. Like this sort of stuff isn't really worth going over because a lot of this has changed over time. So let's move on to patch 1.04. In 1.04, they reduce the Cerulean Hidden Tier, which I believe that's the one that gives you infinite FP, so it doesn't last as long since 1.04. And they also fixed some text. Let's move on to 1.05. One quality of life feature that should be noted that changed in 1.05 was the Twin Maiden Husk. Basically, when you get a bell bearing, it's going to carry over to New Game Plus, which was not a thing originally when the game came out. So that's a really good quality of life addition that they've made in 1.05. I remember in 1.05 shields were overpowered and they had nerf ice spear so that it could not go behind shield, which was a pretty questionable nerf at the time. Even today, I'm not really sure that this was warranted, but still funny to remember that. It was in 1.05 that Seppuku got its heavy blood reduction status buildup nerf. So Seppuku got nerf in 1.05. And to this day, Seppuku has really never been as strong as it was at launch, like nowhere near that. And in 1.05, they also fixed some text. All right, let's move on to 1.06. 1.06 was a big patch because it introduced some of the major changes that have defined what Elden Ring is today. This was a big one, adding the function to send summoning pool signs to summoning pools in multiple area at once. So basically in summoning pools now you can send your sign as a co-op phantom to be available to all the summoning pool that you've discovered. They also added the function to invade larger areas, including distant areas. So any area that you've discovered previously, now you can invade in with the invade everywhere function. So this is akin to a mod that was called Wex Dust in Dark Souls 3. This was a feature that the community requested and Fromsoftware delivered in 1.06, adding the ability to invade everywhere. This was a huge deal for the the lifespan of the game and the activity in general. In 1.06, they also buffed Great Sword, Great Hammers. They tweaked the recovery for a lot of their attack, like jump attack, dual wield attack, and whatnot. They increased the speed of strong attack. Like a lot of the recovery and speed change happened in 1.06 regarding certain classes, but we're mostly going to go over that at the very end at 1.10, and I believe it was 1.8 as well, because I think it was 1.8 had more significant changes to weapon moveset in particular. But it should be noted that they did tweak the recovery in 1.06 for a lot of weapons, actually, like increasing the attack speed of Great Axe and reduce the time it takes for rolling to become possible after like a jump attack, for instance. So stuff like that. They also boost guard counters for a lot of these like worst weapons back in 1.06. So guard counters were much slower before, and they just made it faster. 1.06 also introduced, unfortunately, increased rolling distance when player has a light load or light equipped load. So it was not really until 1.06 that Fromsoftware actually broke the rolling mechanic with light roll. So that's one of the biggest bad change that came with some of the, let's call it like a midway patch with 1.06. They also removed the ultimate power of the one-shot that Glintstone Pebble had. Because before that, Glintstone Pebble could actually one-shot. Now in 1.06, it cannot anymore, and it doesn't always stagger. One good change, and probably the biggest change that came with 1.06, aside from the ability to invade everywhere, was that they finally nerfed Bloodhound Step. Bloodhound Step prior to 1.06 was, I believe it was something like 96 or 98% iframes, which made it basically virtually impossible, like actually impossible to roll catch someone under higher latency due to the way the screens kind of overlap and you have to get a hit check on both players' screens. So it was virtually impossible prior to dispatch to catch someone that was spamming Bloodhound Step. But what they did here is they reduced the iframes for spamming Bloodhound Step, and they also decreased the distance. So Bloodhound Step got a significant nerf in 1.06, but this is not the only nerf that Bloodhound Step will have. There will be another nerf to Bloodhound Step later on. They also shortened the activation interval when using Quick Step skill in succession. So they did a little bit of the same thing with Quick Step, except they didn't reduce the distance. They also increased its ability to circle around the enemy when locked on. That made it so that it's easy now to basically quick step backstab someone on reaction. You don't even need to reverse quick step. You can just quick step to the side and you'll end up behind someone's back. This can be quite dangerous. And yeah, that's one of the changes that came to quick step. Oh yeah, they also increased the travel distance on light load for these Ashes of War, which was not a good thing either. This was one of those like unnecessary change. They really buffed the light load overall quite a lot in 1.06. Decrease the damage and bleed buildup of the weapon skill Corpse Piler. This was the Rivers of Blood nerf, like right here. It happened in 1.06. So Rivers being completely broken prior to that to actually pretty mediocre after that. They hit it really hard. They also, this is on dispatch, that they reduced the tracking for Stars of Ruin. Now though, problem is like they might have corrected Stars of Ruin, but Star Shower is still a problem and performs pretty much the same as Stars of Ruin did prior. So we still have a quote-unquote Stars of Ruin problem in the form of Star Shower. There's also a lot of bug fixes that came with dispatch. One of the more notable change that dispatch did was actually make it so the Hopeline art tier actually did boost physical damage negation, because prior to 1.06 it didn't actually work in PvP. I don't know about PvE, but in PvP it did not actually reduce physical damage. I think it only did elemental. So they actually fixed the Opaline art tier, which is now pretty much the go-to for most players when they PvP. It basically gives you a 10% damage reduction to all elements, whether physical or elemental. So this was a huge change. They also added the error text to unauthorized items. All right, let's move on to 1.07. 1.07 came in hot with a lot of buffs to different attacks. So 1.07 made a lot of things viable that were not previously. One thing of note that they did in 1.07 is they actually fixed shield oppression, because prior to 1.07, shields were extremely powerful and could hardly get guard broken. With 1.07, they increased the stamina attack power for pretty much everything across the board. So now you can actually guard break great shields or shields with a lot of weapons. Namely, fists are still the best at guard breaking great shield, for instance, but there's a lot of ways you can guard break, and shield poking does take more stamina damage now when you're receiving an attack. They also improve poise damage. We're not going to touch too much on poise because this is going to be mainly a topic for patch 1.10, as we mostly care about the state of the poise now, and any poise change that happened in between are not necessarily as important as the changes that came in 1.10 in the current state of the game. They decreased some of the more broken incantation, which is kind of funny because they did not actually get that much of a decrease in damage. Like, for instance, the Magic Dragon Breath can still one-shot, and the Unendurable Frenzy can still one-shot today. So these things, even though they did get nerfed, they can still one-shot. In 1.07, we get to a point where Colossals are in a place where they're much more balanced. The speed is slower than at launch, but it's still fast enough to be usable. I would argue it could be maybe a 1 frame faster, but that's up for debate. So they did some work on the colossal weapons, especially the R1 speed, for instance. Actually, it was in dispatch. The speed and hit detection of colossal sword crouching and rolling attack was decreased. So this was in dispatch that they actually nerfed the crouching colossal meta, but in return they did increase, let's say, the speed of the R1, for instance. They also decreased the recovery for their attack, so colossal got a big overall in 1.07. They also increased the guard penetration ability of, you know, the weapons that go through shield, aka the sights, the shuttle, that sort of stuff. Again, touching on poise for a lot of weapons here, but we're gonna go over the poise changes in 1.10. They also increased the effect of the Great Shield Hammer Talisman. So basically, the Hammer Talisman now is better at guard breaking, and the Great Shield Talisman does its job better, which is to increase your guarding capabilities. They also kind of normalized the effect of guard boosting abilities from Great Shields to normal shields. Like, for instance, in the current version of the game, a barricade medium shield, the Dorito shield, for instance, while barricade is active, it has stronger shield poking, guard reduction than, let's say, a fingerprint on barricade shield, which was a change that happened in 1.07. But when you are taking normal hits, barricade is more effective on great shields still. So little details. They also specifically nerfed fingerprint in 1.07, although it should be noted that fingerprint is still the best great shield by a long shot. One big change that 1.7 brought, or 1.07, is the decrease of the status buildup from dual wielding weapons. So you can definitely feel this nerf now. Don't get me wrong, dual wield status buildup is still particularly strong, but I would argue that the strongest thing about dual wielding now is probably still the damage as opposed to necessarily the status buildup. But it should be noted that status buildup got a significant nerf in 1.07. Here there's a lot of spells that had their move either buffed or decreased. Here, for instance, you know, Glintstone Pebble, increase attack power, Lightning Spear, Flame Sling, increase attack power when charged. There's a lot of these, so a lot of spells across the board got an increase or like a decrease in FP consumption for a lot of those. We're not going to go over each one of them specifically, but know that spells and incantations have been heavily adjusted, and these changes are still present to this day in 1.10. So depending on when you quit playing the game, the attack power, the FP consumption, the recovery, and a lot of these things are going to be different from when you started playing. Carrion Purser had a shortened recovery time, for instance. The Zamor Ice Storm spell had a significant buff. Now it has high attack power, high frostbite buildup, and the casting speed was also shortened. So, for instance, Zamor Ice Storm got a lot better with this patch. Here, this is a bit funny because Bestial Sling technically did get a poise damage reduction, but it was never really enough for this particular spell. Bestial Sling to this day is still a powerhouse and kind of a cheese spell. But yeah, they supposedly decreased the poise damage, but I remember testing that back in 1.07, and it was still doing upward of 100 poise damage at point blank. So the decrease in poise damage for Bestial Sling was never really large enough to be significant. Now, though, with the current Hyper Armor changes, the best bet against Bestial Sling is to just Hyper Armor through it. They also reduced the Scarlet status buildup for the Rot Threat. Same way they touched on Spell, they touched on a lot of Ashes of War. A lot of Ash of War got completely changed in their effectiveness in this patch, for instance. They increased the attack power on a lot of them. They reduced some of them. They changed the recovery on Sword Dance. You might feel it, you might not. It's going to depend on when you stop playing the game. But a lot of them are noteworthy enough, but there's enough of them so that I don't think it's worth going over every single one of them, because the bottom line that you should know is that Ashes of War have changed in their attack power, in their recovery sometimes, in their speed even on some. Like for instance, Impaling Thrust has now a different motion speed and attack power. Like Impaling Thrust and Piercing Fang got faster and are now usable as of patch 1.07. That is still true today. So Piercing Fang was much slower. Same with Impaling Thrust. They were both much slower before, but now, for instance, Piercing Fang can be a real mix-up if you have a threat of a faster attack and then you mix it up with Piercing Fang, which is still slow, but it's fast enough to be usable as a mix-up, for instance. Spinning Slash had an increase in poise damage back then for the heavy version of the Spin Slash, which was a good thing. Now we have another problem with 1.10 with the fast version of the Spinning Slash, but we're gonna go over that in 1.10. Again, a lot of these Ashes of War were changed a lot for the better, I would say. Stormblade, for instance, now spamming Stormblade is much faster than it was before. Also, the fact that Stormblade always stuns now, stuff like this is a pretty big deal and affects gameplay greatly. I love how here they increased the attack power of Flaming Strike. I did not remember that. I feel like Flaming Strike is still one of those outliers in terms of attack power, but maybe that's just me. They did buff the speed of Poison Mist and Chilling Mist, I remember. Now, Poison Mist and Chilling Mist are two of the better Ashes of War. They apply the status effect on your weapon, and they also have strong hyper armor now, and they're basically good usable Ashes of War to use on your weapons. Shield Bash also guard breaks when you land it. That was a noteworthy one. The kick also guard breaks when you land it. That's another noteworthy one. Although unfortunately the kick does not always guarantee a guard break. Like for instance, if you're fighting against a dedicated fingerprint build that has all the stamina boosting talismans on top of having high stamina, the kick will probably need to be landed still like 3 times, 2 or 3 times, depending on what you're fighting against. So even though the kick got a heavy boost, and you will guard break any build that is not necessarily optimized for shield in one kick, it still is going to be a pain to fight a shield build that has been optimized. They also increased the effect of some of the duration of some buff, like for instance Crackblade got an extended duration, same for Warcry. Warcry, for instance, now is 45 seconds. Braga's War, though, is, I believe, 1 minute. It's interesting that they reduced the FP consumption of Raptors of the Mist, because Raptors of the Mist does not consume any FP when someone doesn't land a hit on you in the first part of the Raptor, which is quite interesting. It makes it very spammable. It's actually a problem now. You can recovery cancel Raptors of the Mist into a crouch and basically always be in iframe, or nearly always be in iframe. So that is a problem we have today. Moonlight, they reduce the stamina consumption for strong charge attacks. It's funny because Moonlight now is probably one of the most spammed. Like the Moonlight Blast R2 is one of the most spammed attack you will see out there. A noteworthy change to Ender and and the Grafted Blade was that now they added an effect that prevents staggers from status effect. So obviously sleep and madness will still take effect, but stuff like blood loss and frostbite will not stun endure anymore as of patch 1.07. So this is a huge difference. If you have not played with those changes, it makes endure much more of a threat when status is involved, basically. It should also be noted that as of today, the endure duration is about 3 seconds after you do the endure, whereas the grafted blade is about 5 seconds. So auto vengeance is about 5 seconds. I don't know if these changes happen afterward. I believe there was an adjustment for a 0.1 patch after one of the more major patch, but as of today, 5 second for auto vengeance of not being able to get staggered, and 3 seconds for endure, basically. It's funny because the almighty thunder axe or thunderstorm axe, it got a buff actually in 1.07, so it got faster, and they also made it so it dealt more damage, which back then was funny, and it's still funny today how they actually buffed the thunderstorm axe. Here in 1.07, they fixed certain input drops. Like for instance, there was an input drop when you were two-handing a weapon and you did a jump, then it would eat your input afterward. They did fix that in 1.07, although unfortunately there are still input drops in Elden Ring under various circumstances, such as blocking. Like there's a certain window when you block where it's going to eat your input. There's also a certain window when you pivot where it's going to eat your input as of today. And there is also a window where it will eat your input when you perform a crouch. So be aware of that. We are aware that input drops still are a thing, but should be noted that they did fix some of them, including input drops after jumping, for instance. In 1.07, they fixed the helmet swap glitch where it would regenerate your HP or FP by just spamming equipping and unequipping certain helmets or changing between two. This was a huge abuse that they fixed in 1.07. And they also fixed some text for Colossal Sword. Alright, patch 1.08. If I remember correctly, I believe these were changes in movesets, but let's just take a look. Oh, right, they added some new hairstyles in 1.08, so maybe you've missed that if you have not been keeping in touch with Elden Ring, but 1.08 actually added the Coliseum. So this was pretty major. I mean, you're probably aware of that, of the arena change, but they also added some new hairstyles. 1.08, they reduced the counter attack for trusting attacks. That was a huge deal and still is today. They tweaked the guard breaking ability when shield poking. It's also funny that they reduced the poise damage of a lot of weapons here, and these changes are completely reverted in 1.10 to something completely different, so we're not going to go over it. I only go over the changes that have had an impact on PvP, and this impact is still felt today, for instance. So they did change the speed of a lot of dagger attacks, namely axe attacks, hammers, flail when dual wielded. This change is still felt today. Increase the speed of some attacks for Twin Blades, a Reaper as well, Fist and Claws. A lot of the moveset speed has been adjusted in 1.08, so depending on if you've played before this patch, you might want to revisit a lot of weapon class, because throughout all the game's life cycle, both the speed, the damage, sometimes even the range, depending on how the moveset change, and the recovery have changed over time. And that's true for a lot of weapons. There's not much exceptions for that. Actually, it's funny, one of the exceptions to that is power stance spears. Like double Naginata, from what I remember, is still unchanged to this day. The only thing that has changed for double spear is the status buildup. Actually, and also the poise damage, because now it stuns every time, so it's technically stronger. A big nerf that came with 1.08 was the Trusting Sword crouching attack speed nerf, which is funny because we believe that Fromsoftware got the feedback that they should be nerfing the Trusting Sword crouch attack speed, and I believe that they did not know which Trusting Sword, so they both nerfed the normal Trusting Sword and the heavy Trusting Sword, which is funny because the heavy Trusting Sword crouching attack was never really too fast. So this was a funny nerf that we believe is probably miscommunication, but the normal thrusting sword, like your Clean Rot Rapier, for instance, got a crouching attack speed nerf in 1.08. Another noteworthy nerf was the nerf of Flame Strike. It's not a huge nerf, but they did reduce how much the hitbox lingers. So as you know, Flame Strike today still is extremely powerful and it does still linger, but I believe that this change was good because it lingered for even longer before. Like an example of a change that has no bearing today is that they made Flame of the Redmane useless in 1.08. They made it not stun. So they made it to that the poise damage was reduced so much that you would never stun with it. So there was no reason at 1.08 to use Flame of the Redmane, but they did revert back this change, for instance, in 1.10, where now Flame of the Redmanes does stun. So stuff like that throughout all the patches, I don't go over. Now I'm going over this one just as an example. Another huge bug fix that happened in 1.08 was the ability to regenerate stamina when getting back up from a crouching state while running. So basically you could vortex someone forever, for instance, because you would regenerate back your stamina after crouching. So this was a huge deal. This nerf was a huge deal to vortex crouching weapons such as Power Stance Great Spears. So this was a big nerf to Power Stance Great Spears. And I did not find some text fixing in 1.08. Let's go to 1.09. 1.09 was the almighty ray tracing patch, which if you've tried ray tracing, you will have noticed absolutely nothing. This is probably the worst implementation of ray tracing that I've ever seen. The change to shadow is so minuscule that you would be a little bit crazy unless you have like a powerhouse of a PC to have ray tracing enabled in this game, because it legitimately makes like no difference. It makes no difference in visual quality and it will tank your performance greatly. So probably one of the worst ray tracing implementation I have ever seen to this day. A huge change that came with 1.09 was the decrease of the dual wielding jump attack. So the good old double anchor one-shot build kind of got heavily nerfed in 1.09. You can still do wonders with jump attacks, don't get me wrong, but it is a huge difference. There's no more like insane one-shotting without buffing like crazy, and even then I believe you could still resist it. In patches prior, in 1.08, they had buffed the fist weapon class so that the attack speed and everything was more threatening, and then in 1.09 they reverted some of these changes. So for instance, Kestis has a lower hit stun on the R2, for instance, despite the R2 being faster. So all in all, the fist weapons are different from when the game came out, but they went through a series of changes back and forth, if you may. So now the current state of fist weapons is basically, depending on what you fight against, you might lose priority after you land, let's say, an R2 for Kestis, but we'll still keep priority after you land an R2 with Starfist, for instance, because they do have a different R2 moveset. So that is one thing. They did decrease the insane magic power increase that Terra Magica gave as well. They also decreased the insane attack power increase that Royal Knight Resolve and Determination gave. They nerfed the Jellyfish Shield, which you could apply while not even having the shield equipped. Now that is not the case anymore. You need to have the Jellyfish Shield equipped in order to have the damage bone. They decreased the effectiveness of the Claw Talisman. So jumping attack got a huge overall nerf in this patch. They also decreased the effectiveness of the Lords of Blood Exaltation Talisman. That's the talisman that gives damage boost when a bleed occurs. So they did nerf that, and same vein as the talisman, they nerfed the White Mask as well. They also decreased the jumping attack damage increase that Raptor's Black Feather armor gave. So again, overall decrease in jumping attack damage. They also normalized a little bit the elemental damage by reducing the shrouding crack tiers of various kinds. So your tier increase elemental damage is now not as much as it was prior, but do not get me wrong, it is still absolutely worth it to run it on any serious build. It's still an incredibly powerful effect despite that nerf. I believe it is actually 40%. I could be wrong on that, but yeah, that's something that should be noted. That's also another funny one. They did add an invincibility window when you're respawning in the Coliseum, because unfortunately that did not exist at launch, but now it does. To compensate for the tier elemental debuff, they actually did buff the normal elemental damage. So they made it so that your damage is less reliant on a buff and more reliant on your stats, which I believe was a pretty good change. Elemental weapons now are very, very strong. Like for instance, if you are running a dexterity build, there's a good chance that your weapon might perform best lightning infused as opposed to keen infused, depending on your stats. You need to have heavy investment into dexterity, for instance, for a keen infusion to make more sense over lightning. That is obviously weapon dependent, but that is something that you should pay attention to when you're making your build. They also tweaked the scaling of colossal weapons. They did increase a little bit of the damage for a few colossal weapons. This change was a little bit funny because from our testing, like some colossal weapons get like a 10 damage boost out of this scaling, which was a bit laughable. I still do think that to this day, like especially two-handed colossal weapons do not do enough damage in comparison to power stance weapon. Like for instance, you could have a giant crusher that will get out damaged by double katana, for instance. Again, they also tweak the speed and range and recovery of a lot of weapons, namely the great weapons. This change is heavily felt now. Like right now, for instance, greatsword have a very long and fast running attack. Same for curved greatsword. So those are some of the changes that are heavily felt today. It's that greatsword and curved greatsword are absolute powerhouse now. They're not like off meta weapons anymore. I don't know if I would call them meta now, but they most definitely can compete with a lot of things, namely because of their very fast moveset and also the changes that came with 1.10, which we are going to go over as well. But I think what was most important was the speed increase to a lot of their attacks and the range increase that came with 1.09. These moveset changes also affected a lot of other classes. We're not going to go over all of them, but again, depending on when you've played the game last, you might want to check out every weapon because all the moveset have technically changed over time. The guard counter speed is also increased across the board. This one here increased the damage of claw weapons. It's funny because this change is a bit of a head scratcher because today claws are a bit of an outlier in terms of weapon damage. I don't know why they decided to increase claw damage because right now the strongest weapon in terms of DPS combo deletion is the Raptor's Talon. It can kill someone in 2 combos. So you only need to land 2 hits and you're going to get a bleed proc on top of doing insane damage. So claw weapons here, not sure why this damage addition was made here, but you can absolutely feel the insane damage of claw weapons today for sure. They did change the way a holy damage liver, for instance, was affected. I don't know if it is this patch in particular, but holy damage, if you eat the liver, prior to that, it was 30% damage reduction for the holy liver. Now it's back in line with the other livers, which I believe is around 10%. Here, you know, to appease the complaint, they slightly reduced the travel distance for light rolling. Unfortunately though, this change was very minor and did not affect light roll that much, unfortunately. Again, they kept touching on various Ashes of War. We're not going to go over all of them. And there was a lot of bug fixes as well in this patch that we are not necessarily going to go over. Alright, now to 1.10, finally. 1.10, the biggest patch that Elden Ring's got. Also, we've been sitting on 1.10 for, I think, over 7 months now. I don't know how long it's been, actually. The patch came out, yeah, it came out a long time ago, guys. Okay, so for 1.10, it's funny because I don't even need to read these ones because since this is the biggest patch, I remember these changes by heart. So the big lines of 1.10 is that now you have increased poise damage for nearly every weapon and spell in the game, which means that for the first time in 1.10, your two-handed curved sword will always stun 133 poise at neutral with your first attack. The second attack, however, will do 88 poise damage. So 88 is a major poise breakpoint for your build. So if you are wondering about poise, most medium weapons will do over 133 poise damage on the first hit, and will do 88 poise damage on the following hit. So 88 poise is a big breakpoint. Same way, one-handed thrusting sword do 109 poise damage when one-handed, or sorry, 108 poise damage, I believe, which makes 109 poise a common breakpoint for your armor. There's also other breakpoints that are noteworthy. To tank the first part of the Raptor Talon R2, for instance, you need, I believe, 120 poise. So that makes it a noteworthy breakpoint when you're playing against Raptor Talon, because if you don't have that breakpoint, you might get deleted by the combo. Same way with Spin Slash. The Spin Slash that we have now, which is ridiculously fast, always poise breaks on the first spin, and also has Hyper Armor, which was added in this patch. This is a problem, so you will actually need, I believe I was told it was 123 poise to tank the second spin of the 3-spin Spin Slash, the fast version on small weapons. So those are some noteworthy poise breakpoints that you might want to take a look at. They also increase the poise damage for spells as well, and skills. Like for instance, Moonveil Katana, at some point you could not tank the blast, and then they changed it so that you could tank the blast and poise through it. But at 1.10 now you can't tank the Moonveil Ash of War anymore, so you will always get stunned by the Moonveil Blast. This is also a problem with stuff like Death Ritual Spear, where the arrows come out of the air and always stun you with always maximum poise damage. So that's a huge problem that came with the increased poise damage. But you also have some positive, because now your one-handed straight sword is now usable because it always poise break on the first hit. So some of these changes are good, some of these changes are bad. It's a bit of a mixed bag, but in my opinion, a lot of the idea of 1.10 was a step in the right direction. They also added something that's very important. Now you take less damage while you are performing an hyper armor attack, depending on your weapon. So colossal weapons, for instance, you have your colossal hammer. You're going to take a set amount of damage when you're not attacking, and when you're attacking with your colossal weapon, you will take decreased damage. This is in order to win trades, because that's the only way colossal weapons can get damage in. It's by trading, and it is not necessarily neither overdone nor underdone. I think this was one of the better change that came with 1.10. Here, this is a very important one. The backstab grab was changed, so the backstab angle is more generous in 1.10. It is not Dark Souls 3 like backstab. You still have an angle check, but it's much more generous than in any previous state that Elden Ring was. Backstab is unironically in a pretty decent state right now. I think it would still be a little bit higher, but not by much. But that's just nitpicking at this point. I think backstab grabs are actually not bad at all the way they are now. Another really good change that came with 1.10 was the nerf again to Quickstep and Bloodhound Step. So they made it for the first time where Quickstep and Bloodhound Step have less iframes or invincibility frames than normal rolling, which finally makes it to a place where they're still very strong, and they always will be, because it's a dodge on click as opposed to dodge on release like the roll button. But despite that, I believe that they are in a decent state now, and I would not necessarily consider them as much of an issue. The distance for Bloodhound Step is still felt and can still shut down a lot of weapons and setups. But I believe that the focus should now be more toward light roll, which is still a problem and mostly unchanged to this day. So Quickstep and Bloodhound Step got their proper nerf. Now they have less invincibility frames. They have even less when spamming them, and that makes it so that you can effectively catch them, unlike before. So that's a very, very good change. They also changed a lot of things regarding hyper armor. Main thing with hyper armor now is that your big weapons will have a lot of hyper armor, so much so actually that you're not going to be able to break a great weapon's hyper armor while using a great weapon yourself, unless you're doing like a ridiculously slow attack like a fully charged R2 or a jumping heavy R2 attack. So unfortunately they did mess up with their tweaking of the hyper armor, but it is not too far from where it should be at. Another problem that came with the hyper armor change was that they gave a lot of Ashes of War some hyper armor, and this ended up making it so that stuff like Storm Assault starts hyper armor at basically frame 1. So instead of rolling, you could basically just Storm Assault, and you will always be able to poise your enemy and then trade some damage for free. So these sort of stuffs are extremely game breaking, and these problems came with patch 1.10. So these are some of the problems that 1.10 came with. I have a vid where I give some feedback, and I have translated this video in Japanese. It's still both Japanese and English. I'll link this vid in the description if you want to take a look at some of the problems that 1.10 has, for instance. They also increased the the critical hit damage. This one is a mixed bag because I think the backstab damage right now is in a good place, and that is due to this increase here. But on the other hand, the parry critical damage is perhaps too high, but this could also be mostly a problem, a Misericord dagger problem, whereas Misericord is an outlier in terms of critical damage, for instance. So be wary of that. Your critical damage is extremely high now. If you get parried, there's a good chance you might get one shot by a Misericord dagger. They also did reduce the insane recovery that came after missing a backstab. It's still too high, but it's a little bit better than what we had before. They also gave the false backstab grab an actual hit, which, you know, it's good, but I think it's a little bit overshadowed by recovery time after missing a backstab grab. And most importantly, Fromsoftware did finally correct some text again in 1.10. After editing this entire vid, there's a few things I want to mention that I did not touch over. Is that buffs in general got heavily reduced, namely self-buff, like for instance magic resistance went from 60% to 20%, which was good because before it was a complete shutdown, now it's much more balanced. However, spell spamming is still obviously a problem, but I believe that the buff issue is taken care of. Now we would need to address the spell specific or spam specific issues. There's also aim punching that got mitigated, so it's still in the game, but it's not as bad as it was previously. Those are the big changes that came throughout the entire Elden Ring lifespan. Depending on when you stop paying attention to the game, these are the changes that are noteworthy, and this is the state of the game that we have now. So if you want to come back, my advice to you would be to go over each and every single weapon in Ash of War and spells just as if the game was new, because so many changes happen between the launch of Elden Ring to now, whereas it doesn't really matter what you pick up unless it's double spear. There's not much that stayed the same throughout the lifespan of the game. So I hope you found this video informative, and I'll catch you guys up next time. Take care, guys.